Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me in this short webinar on self-love as a radical act. All the studies and the resources mentioned are going to be listed in the text accompanying this video, in the transcript and on the Young Women's Movement blog. So to start and to clarify, female and woman are not taken to mean essentialised or categories based on biological features. The two terms are used to include all women, so that is cis, trans women, intersex women, non-binary femmes, and all queer folk who in some way relate to experiences of womanhood. Okay, so self-love as a radical act in everyday conversation is often accompanied, sometimes rightly so, by a roll of the eyes. Hashtag self-love, hashtag self-care, hashtag false idols. The practice has been taken up by a capitalist mantra, and it's not the type that I'm talking about. Self-love, as we will see, is radical when any marginalised folk practice it. In doing so, we're contradicting the idea that we are lesser by consciously moving away from our worth as determined by economic or social productivity measures. Self-love isn't an exchange currency, and not everyone, aka those who with power who benefit from inequitable systems, want to recognise its benefits. Self-love is political because, as women, we are repeatedly socialised to despise ourselves, shrink ourselves, and put the needs of all others above ours. Self-love is a specific form of self-care. Self-care is a generalised term that has, unfortunately, been appropriated by big business to sell us well-being, though I do think you can still engage with it authentically. Its radical origins, however, are in Black feminist and civil rights thought. Self-love, as a branch of self-care, is an intensified version of the latter. It asks us to practice love inwardly, be that in forms of accountability and forgiveness, scoping healthy boundaries, and carving out time for things, thoughts and behaviours that work for us and ultimately our community. And by community, I mean the feminist community in general, but it also applies to personal communities and in whatever capacity the term means to you. So, in Solange's 2016 album, A Seat at the Table, she features a song titled Borderline, brackets, an ode to self-care. The lyrics stating, gotta go ahead and take some time. And now, during this tumultuous time, when everything is even more difficult than before, thinking about self-love can ultimately help both in the present and in carving out a better future, one that doesn't rely on racist exploitation and gender inequality coupled with uncapped demolition of ecosystems. Self-love asks us, as women, to prioritise boundaries, time and well-being in order to better care for our communities once we've cared for ourselves. If we don't do this consistently, we can experience burnout and ill health. So self-care or self-love is the practice of generating sustainable activism and organising in parallel to well-being. Self-love is political and it always has been part of the social justice fight. It's just been unfortunately misappropriated. In this webinar then, what we'll talk about is what we mean by self-love, question why it's radical, and finish with 2 tips on practicing self-love as women. This webinar isn't going to advocate practicing a positive outlook or drinking green tea as a radical act of self-love. It advocates for self-reflection, holding yourself accountable for privileges, and being able to extend your sustainable practice into your communities. It is political. You don't have to engage in positive outlooks when your life is consistently overlooked and shaped by oppressors and oppressive regimes. You can be a feminist killjoy and still engage with radical self-love. Thank you, Sarah Ahmed. So, moving to the self. We are part of communities, interlocked into wider systems of relationships, so much so that we are never truly an individual, however much neoliberal logic tries to make us work in this way. In this sense, the self is part of a larger community, which needs to be equally respected in the way we treat others, care for others, and hope for others. Self-love, as is the case in wider talks about well-being, cannot be treated as an individual or isolated practice because it makes any issues we have, like being lonely or being sick or fatigued, a personal burden rather than a reflection of the exploitative system of power we live our daily lives in. In our Western conception of the self, it's much more individuate than in other cultures, but we can come to know ourselves through others and vice versa. It is formed contextually. Loving the self does not mean falling into a neoliberal form of self-care. In fact, self-care is part of the mutual care dynamic that we so vitally need. Self-care is not limited to solitary self-indulgence. that's community-driven in concentric circles with the self. Being connected is central. Cederstrom and Spicer, in 2014, the authors behind the Wellbeing Syndrome, have cautioned against the obsessive ideological ritualization, so commodification, of self-care and love that works to counteract collective engagement, thus turning problems, especially socioeconomic problems, into maladaptive individualization. In order to overcome injustices, solidarities must be rebuilt, mutual aid practice, and confidence in our collective capacity repeatedly built. And the first step in generating a sustainable way of life in this way is engaging with self-love. However, as Sarah Arbed notes, sharing feelings about how our political work, feminist, queer, anti-racist work, affects our bodies, bones, minds, must not be swept under the umbrella of neoliberal symptoms. If we do this form of totalising, we're not actually being heard. But I do hate all this chat that is unfortunately linked to wellbeing ideology that's about self-optimization and your biggest barrier is you and all that bull, because it completely ignores how lived experiences are structured through, by, and in response to the white supremacist heteropatriarchy, and it overlooks the completely radical foundation of the self-love ideology. So with that in mind, let's turn to its origins. So, self-care and self-love initially began as a medical concept and became politicised through the civil rights movement, who generated some of the first communities of care that are so central now to feminism. The term was in response to the complete lack of health and medical care offered to Black people and people of colour communities. It's also a way of reclaiming autonomy. Angela Davies noted that a significant difference between activism and specifically feminism in the 60s and 70s and now is the focus on self-care and love as a productive and holistic approach to organising and conscious raising. We have the civil rights movement to thank. One of the most widely cited comments on self-love and care comes from Audre Lorde, who, as you already may know, talked about self-preservation as a vital quality of self-love and care. She says, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." So in this webinar, self-love and self-care is a political practice. Prioritising the self is a part of a circular process of being able to then care for a community. So why is self-love radical? Well, Dr. Shanisha Brooks Tatum sees self-love and care as subversive when applied to womanhood because it centralises the self. She says, quote, "When we support our sisters and admonish that they too take care of themselves, we engage in radical feminist practice," end quote. We can see this as particularly subversive for Black women and women of colour, who've historically been forced and coerced into caring for all others but themselves, which is still happening to this day in the current crisis. Self-love and care may not seem so radical because often when it's talked about, it's been divorced from its political roots and appropriated by capitalism. But to love and to validate yourself in response to and in the midst of daily onslaught of oppression and toxicity, it's political radically. It's radical because as women, we're not meant to be full or to survive or to be autonomous or to exceed or spill over the boundaries set by society. It's radical because we are not supposed to recognise self-love and care as a worthwhile regenerative practice. As Ahmed notes, quote, "In directing our care towards ourselves, we are redirecting care away from its proper objects. We are not caring for those we are supposed to care for. We are not caring for the bodies deemed worth caring about. We reassemble ourselves through the ordinary, everyday, and often painstaking work of looking after ourselves, looking after each other. This is why, when we have to insist, I matter, we are transforming what matters. Women's lives matter, Black lives matter, queer lives matter, disabled lives matter, trans lives matter, the poor, the elderly, the incarcerated matter," end quote. I think that's really powerful. So we need to take time and incorporate into our activism, replenishing our emotional stores that help us to challenge the state of the world. It isn't counter-revolutionary, but it enables revolutions. And the work of self-love happens in the everyday. It happens when you get up and interact within a world that is based on compliance and suppression. In what Laura Penny notes, quote, "A world whose abusive logic wants you to see no structural problems but only problems with yourself or with those more marginalised and more vulnerable than you are," end quote. Laurie Penny asks us to consider self-love and care as a doing word. It's active. It requires mundane, everyday work to care and extend compassion and forgiveness. It's difficult, and women are often the worst at it because we've been brought up to understand ourselves not as deserving of any kind of relief. Echoing the words of Bell Hooks, under an imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, we are consistently made to dislocate the centering of primary care of the self. Self-love and care is radical when we move away from the belief that worth and value is intrinsically tied to particular forms of production and consumption. Hedver, in Sick Woman Theory, claims being political does not need to be public. Caring and indeed loving the self is one of the most revolutionary things as we interact within a society that is structured on predatory behaviours that shrink women and make themselves feel like they are in a constantly unending project of self-improvement. You can check out my webinar on body shame for more on that specifically. So as we can see, self-love is radical because it prioritises caring for the self in concentric circles with caring for communities. It's radical because it ultimately strengthens the capacity of revolutionary movements that ask society to see people not as economic players, hierarchically organised, of whom certain bodies are stratified into more or less deserving of dignity. Instead, it asks society to reimagine the value of care and what it enables, as well as considering who are in the positions where those who need to take more time for personal love are often the ones extending it to everyone else first. It's radical because it questions the distribution of emotional resources. For the first example of self-love, what we have is setting boundaries. So, I know that this is way easier said than done, especially if you have multiple caring responsibilities. Our society puts a premium on being busy, so much so that boundaries are often crossed, burnout common, and sadness and exhaustion fetishized. We need to stay informed to act, but we need to do it in a sustainable way. We, as women, do a disproportionate amount of emotional, professional, and domestic labour, which is only intensified when we think of women who are further marginalised. We need to recognise that although being able to set boundaries shouldn't be a luxury or privilege, for many marginalised folk it's not realistic or safe to do so. So for those who can, we must, in order to support in the future those who can't right now. This goes back to the idea of self-love as being able to support your communities. So set boundaries of what you can and want to do, as what your limits are, social, professional, personal, set realistic goals through intentional boundaries. Being mindful of how you speak to and about yourself. Get comfortable with saying, no, that's not funny, or get used to the possible feeling of discomfort when asserting yourself. Self-love enables you to support your community more sustainably by honouring your needs and work within the boundaries you have set for yourself. By setting intentional boundaries, we're able to counteract their idea that women are free-flowing reservoirs of education, emotion, and capacity. In setting boundaries, it's easier to understand when lines have been crossed, or when you're close to burnout or exhaustion, and when you need to take time to rest in whatever way you feel. Setting boundaries isn't an exercise in mapping all situations you can think of and writing your values alongside it, but it is about recognising the values that you hold, where they came from, and how they interact with the world you're helping to create. So to the second example of self-love, a second tip, it follows on from the first, and it's taking stock and checking in with yourself. Hooks notes that feminism has embraced self-interrogation, and we need to be able to be particularly sensitive to how we are feeling and see this as a source of political activism in itself. Emotions have been, and still are, dismissed as hysterical expressions of untamed minds, which to be honest sounds kind of great. But acknowledging and acting on the very real needs we have is important. It creates distance between yourself, your community, and toxicity, and is a vital ingredient for political change. Checking in with yourself helps to develop your feminist activism because it contradicts the patriarchy by asserting you matter, what you feel matters, and it's legitimate. Any form of revolution is not going to come about through being constantly overwhelmed by guilt and sadness, though I'm not saying it's your responsibility when you feel this. But sometimes nihilism forms a lot of the lefty boys' practice of activism or organising. However, late capitalism is as good a reason as any not to feel like getting out of bed. To do whatever it takes to help make your life worth living, which might mean taking time away from the news or pressing pause on the myriad forms of activism women are inevitably involved in, or saying no to someone offering free or paid labour if you don't feel up for it. We cannot and should not fetishize despair, nihilism, and overwork. By checking in with yourself, though, you're developing your most intimate personal relationship, as well as generating time to take account of feelings of discomfort. For example, if you've been called out, why a certain relationship makes you feel sad, how you're understanding your experiences. It helps create a deeper reflective practice that is central to feminism. In taking this time to extend forgiveness and compassion to yourself through possibly holding yourself to account of you and your privileges, working on them and knowing your limits and your boundaries, this is how the feminist community can truly be feminist. Self-love as a radical act is knowing there are limits to what you can do. The starting point to generating any kind of inclusive, sustainable practice is in understanding yourself through the lens of compassion, forgiveness, and determination in any form to collectively dismantle oppressive structures. 2 resources that can help you start this journey, a journey that isn't momentary but with you throughout your life, is by Jace Ha and Frida. The first, created by Jace Ha, who is a queer writer and mental health activist, is an interactive self-care checklist, which is in the resources, as a way to maintain and practice self-love and care. The second comes from the Young Feminist Fund, Frida, and their documents on burnout, self and collective care, and holistic security and collective well-being. Also, there's a link in the resources to a 128-page book, a collaborative book on self-care and love, developed by Artemisa, Alife, and Kriya in 2006, which details really well how to create a feminist practice with self-love central. It's really good. Right, so as feminists, our activism is hard work. And I'm saying heart, but also hard work. Ignoring making time and space for self-love and care does not benefit anyone or any form of justice. Self-love is not an individual act. It's like throwing a rock into a body of water. The self disappears into the larger collective. It generates ripples, change, and moves beyond its starting point. In practicing self-love, we invite others in too. Self-love is an ongoing collective intervention into daily practice that centres self-love and care as a vital feminist response to the daily micro and macroaggressions we face. However, as Ahmed argues, quote, feminism is repackaged as being about upward mobility for some women, leaning, awful, those who accept responsibilities for their own well-being and self-care as a way some women distance themselves from others. I've no doubt we need to engage in critiques of such form of neoliberalism and accept that feminism can become co-opted as a white woman's upward mobility fantasy, end quote. Unequal burdens of domestic and emotional labour fall on women, but much more so on women of colour and black women. White feminism really ruins things for everyone except Karen and Becky, and we need to centralise self-love as a period of reflection on privilege, accountability, and vulnerability. To conclude, self-love is a radical act because it repositions women's well-being as equally important to others and explicitly and consciously incorporates self-love as a practice into broader projects of social change. It does so through reflection, drawing boundaries of capacity, and seeing emotions as integral to any form of justice work. Caring for yourself enables us to better care for our communities, to use our privileges for others, and to leave the cloak of guilt we as women feel when we put our feelings and needs in parallel with the oppressors in society. Ooh, so thanks for checking in and checking out this webinar. Make sure you look at some of the resources mentioned because they've been really helpful for me and some of my pals that have already looked at them. Yeah, it was great. Let me know what you think and have a good day as much as you can.